Alright, so now that we got the idea about how film itself came to be and how long it took to make the actual equipment and test it, we are now ready to take a look at some of the early films. Now, like I said before, I'm only talking about the films that were important because they were the first film to do a certain thing, and you'll be seeing that a lot in this episode, or they were famous for a different reason. So, with that being said, let's get started with some of the early films that's left an impact on a lot of people. So we know in the last episode, the first camera was made in the late 1880s, and the first film was in 1888. So after the year, more people have been trying to get their own hands at filming and began experimenting different things. Starting in 1890 with William K. Laird Dixon, his first experimental film was the first motion picture camera, the kinescope. The experiment was named the Monkey Shine, which was the first motion picture in the U.S. The feature was about a laboratory assistant, and it was filmed by using a tiny image that would be rotated around the cylinder. Later, he and Thomas Edison will also invent a kinescope as a single-viewer peep show in which the film was passed to light. This was the first recognizable motion picture machine, and it was the first to be shown by the public. It would later feature a short film in which it was just Dixon greeting the people by taking off his hat and bowing. Later, Edison got his own kinescope in 1893 and began making some more film series with it. While Dixon and Edison was still working on some more films and camera work, in 1892 we get to see the world's first animated feature, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, Pave Period, directed by Charles Emile Raymond. This was the first time people got to see an animated film. The whole animation was in color, and it took the director 500 frames to make it. As you can imagine, this was something that no one has ever seen before. When you look at it now, you can tell that a lot of hard work was put into this. This is one of those films that was really important to both the film and the animation history. Back to Thomas Edison and his first motion picture studio in West Orange, New Jersey, the Black Maria. The studio itself cost about $637 to make. Once it was finished, it would soon start to have many performers, like Eugene, Ruth, Annie, and Buffalo Bill Cody. Now with everything in place, Thomas is ready to display his own version of the kinescope project at the World's Exhibits in Chicago, and with it, he got to show his own kinescope movie camera and his driven peep show. So in May in 1893, he showed a 30-second film called Blacksmith Scene. All of this is just three guys pretending to be blacksmiths. April 14 rolls around and we get to see the first ever film theater. Well, sort of. The kinescope was soon shown by more people, mostly men, and they would pay at least 5 cents in order to see any films. It was just basically a single-view peep show, which would either show female dancers, boxers, or bodybuilders. I know it may not seem that exciting today, but this was still new to people back then, and it did caught on, so much that there were more peep show parlors in penny arcades, hotel lobbies, and even photograph parlors in major cities in the U.S. Now we get to see more people trying their hands at being directors, and in 1895 we got to meet the Lumiere brothers, one of the first French directors who made some films for France, and they would show their first film in a private section on March 22, 1895. The film was titled Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory, and yeah, it's just a group of people leaving a factory. But it did work with the studio, because again, this was something that nobody's ever seen before, and they would soon show this to the public on December 28, 1895, along with 9 other films they've made. However, they would soon sell their camera to George Méliès. You might want to remember him because he'll play an important part in our film's history later. Now that we got the sets and the actors and even the camera, there was one thing that was still missing, and that was the sound. Now, even though the film was still new to people, they did try to find a way to put sound in the camera back then and even a little bit after this year. For the films that didn't have sound, a person would be at front of the screen and play a piano music to put something into the film. and not just have it to be dead silence. However, since Edison did make a phonograph, he and Dickson tried to make a film camera that would also capture the sound. What they did is that they put a phonograph right next to the camera with a pulley system, and there is a film where they tried to experiment with it. However, it didn't go well as Edison thought it would. The reason being was because there was really no way you could have done this back in the day yet. And it would take a really long time for a camera that would actually physically record a sound. So we would still have more years of a film with no sound. But on a happier note, Dickson did make the first and oldest movie company in America, the American Motoscope Company. And we get the first ever special effects, known as today the jump cut, with the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Later, on October 19th, 1896, we get the first ever movie theater in the world, hosting about 72 seats for each person, and it was also the first time that a film from another country would be shown here in the U.S., using with the new company, the Fetted Fares, and Mark had a contact with them and the Lumiere brothers, who would show their films for the first time in the United States. Now, do you remember George Méliès? Well, now it's time to see what this guy can do. This guy is a very special type of filmmaker. You see, most films at the time didn't have that much special effects. I mean, they tried sound and a little bit with animation, but George is one of the earliest directors that is to try a hand at special effects. The first film is The Vanishing Lady. It's a film based on the trick of substance. This film is a stop trick. This is where someone places an object on a camera, and then when the camera is turned off, a person or an object can be removed, and then the camera is turned back on again. But later, George would use this type of effect for other films, like The Haunted Castle or The Devil's Castle. This will mark as the first ever horror film in the industry. But the funny thing is, this was kind of meant to be a comedy, but people kind of found this somewhat scary. Don't ask. So the film is about a devil as he does devilish things like turning into a bat, it happens, and making a woman out of a culprit. The film was shot outside of Méliès' garden with a painted scenery, and this is also an example of having more than one actor in a film. However, since there were no credits, we don't know who was in what film. Except for the woman named Jenny D. Ellis, who you may know from The Vanishing Lady, and she would also appear in other George's films, and later become his second wife. And people thought that the devil was played by another famous magician, when in reality that's actually George Méliès playing the devil. Another thing about George that was also kind of unique is that his movies will be a bit long than the average movies from the time. For example, most of the time around the 1890s, movies were somewhat about under a minute, but also keep in mind that these were experimental, so George's films would sometimes hit around 3 minutes or even longer than 10 minutes at the time. And later on, George Méliès would have his own film studio that looks like a greenhouse with a roof and walls in the size of rectangular blinds glazed on. 1896 was also the year that our first female director would be introduced. Alice Guy is the first time that a woman was the director for a film. She started off as a secretary at Leon Garamond in 1894. Then she would join Garamond in their new filming company of April of 1895. She was the head of the motion picture production at the studio. Then when she saw the Lumiere brothers' first film, she saw that there was something that a film could do and have. So she went out to Leon and just simply asked, "Hey, can I make a film?" And he gave her the permission to do so, and she made her first ever film. Now this film is very important because this is the first fiction film ever to be made, like a fairy tale type of story. But this is also the first film where it has a narrative story, and it will really help future directors to take notice and use it for some of their feature films. The film is called The Cabbage Fairy, and it's basically how Cabbage Patch Kids were born. So now we finally reach 1899. This was the year where film was really starting to almost reach the boom year. Films were starting to become more common, but it wasn't really that popular yet, as we still had some few theaters with only some few directors and actors, but it was getting there. So we start to see more theaters being made, and there were more directors trying to be really creative with some of these films, in either A, to tell a story, or B, they just want to be creative and show what they can do. 1899 is also the year where we start to see films based on books. This is a year where people were starting to be stumped on how to write a movie or how to make a story. So what they did is that they started making films based on other popular stuff, like books or plays. The first movie to be based on the book was Cinderella, directed by good old Méliès. Now, Cinderella was very important to both George and the film as a whole, because not only is this the first movie based on a story, but this film was very, very popular when it first came out. Like, people loved this movie before Disney would try to make their own version. This was also the film where George went all out with this. Like, he tried many things that people have never seen before. For example, this is the first movie to have more than just one scene. Like, it actually has a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's at different scenes. Unlike any other movies where it was just one scene, and that was it. Like, first it started at a house, and then we're at the dance scene, and then it's back to the house, and so on. This was big at the time, and the way George did was by dissolving each of the sets and moves onto the next scene. This was a success when it first came out in France, Europe, and America. Almost everyone really loved this film, because it was something new, and this was something that was entertaining to watch. And this film would inspire George to make more films that would have stories and different scenes. We'll be seeing some of those later. The Humpty Dumpty Circus was a silent film that marks the first time of stop-motion animation. Director Albert E. Smith made the film by using his daughter's circus toys. Sadly, this is considered to be a lost film, and as of right now, no one has found a copy of this yet. Haverstraw Tunnel became a popular film, technically being the first film to have a first-person point view, although technically it's not really a person, but more so a camera that was mounted onto a train. The 1890s also marked the first time we get sports in any type of film. The first type of sports to be featured was boxing, and we had a total of 3 for this decade, the longest one being in 1897 at 100 minutes. 1898 was also the year we got to see some religion themes in films. One of the two is directed by George Méliès, called The Devil is Inconvenient, and is kind of a parody of religions and the monarch's life. So yes, this did exist even way back when film first started. In 1898, we get to see the first ever documentary films. One of these was Divers at Work on the Wreck of the Maine. It was the first film to be shot in Cuba, which is where the location of the sunken warship was in the Spanish-American War.